appreciate you all taking the time day in and day out. We want you to be entertained, informed from a Christian worldview, to recognize God knows you, God loves you, He created you, and you're worth it, and your rights come from God. And I just don't want the state to become your daddy or to buy into that idea, because what that sets up is you don't use your godly gifts and you don't maximize what you can do here for the kingdom of Christ, for what to grow and to learn. I want you to be free, and freedom has gotten a bad rap lately. It's gotten a really bad rap lately. I give you President Obama. This is really interesting. This is President Obama's idea of how the economy works. It hasn't changed. This is a dated clip, but roll it.
When you've got some extra money in your pockets, then you go get some pizza from Brenda. And then Brenda decides maybe she can afford to hire another worker. That's how we grow our economy. If we're investing in roads and bridges, putting some hard hats back to work, getting our steel workers back to work, they've got more money to spend. Maybe they buy that new computer. Maybe they decide to take a little vacation. And all that money circulates in the economy, and it makes us all grow.
It's like the Colbert audience or the Jon Stewart laughs at anything. So, yeah. What is he really saying? There's a problem in this country. We have politicians, actually Republicans too, Republicans and Democrats, who go out and tell economic fairy tales. So in order to get the truth, we go to folks like author of Iconoclast, Dr. Brian Domitrovic, got a doctorate in history at Harvard. He is a professor of economics and chair at Sam Houston University. And past, present, and future, he writes under that label over at Forbes.com. Professor, welcome back.
Great to be here, Craig.
Now, when you hear President Obama, I don't know if you got to hear the clip, but it's the idea of how the economy works. And oftentimes that's through government investment or government artificially pressing on people to raise the wage when it comes to minimum wage. And there's a lot of talk about investment, etc. My question to you is, you hear a lot of myths out there. What are the most common myths that we hear, economic myths that we hear from our politicians? And how do they hurt us?
You hit on the biggest one, Crane. It's the morphing of government spending into investments. I mean, we used to call it government spending, maybe expenditures. Now we call it investment. I mean, that's just a complete myth. The other thing is that there's a cycle of boom and bust in the economy that the government has to solve. The Great Depression was a bust. The government had to solve it. The Great Recession is a bust. The government had to solve it. Well, that's wrong. The government caused those busts, and it's the private sector that has to solve them.
Okay, but if I'm looking at the private sector solving them, that we're not going to be rescued from those big bad banks who took advantage of us, and people got loans they didn't deserve and didn't understand. We just couldn't handle it, and they made off. You know, those Wall Street guys, they're always out to hurt us on Main Street. So if I look at that, who's going to protect us from Wall Street, Professor?
No, I mean, the government's always looking for a bogeyman. I mean, if you look at the history of all the recessions, really, that we've had since the creation of the Fed and the income tax over 100 years ago, every single one of them was caused by the big institutions that the government uses to intervene in the economy. George Bush's little recession in 2001 because there wasn't a tax cut. The Great Recession because the Fed had been way too loose. Did Wall Street take all that money the Fed provided from 2002 on? You bet they did. The reason wasn't the Wall Street banks. The reason was money was so cheap. That's why gold went up to $1,800 an ounce.
Okay, but how, those unfamiliar with how the Fed works, and could you give us a thumbnail sketch of how lower interest rates and printing money actually hurts us, and how that was done, as you mentioned, by George W. Bush? I look at Reagan and Clinton, both had strong dollars and both Clinton arguably had a better economy than George W. Bush, but I digress. How does that Fed system work, and how is it the cause, as you've stated?
If the Federal Reserve produces too much money, then people who might be prone to invest their money in job-creating enterprises and businesses will probably take that money away and try to hedge the dollar. They'll try to buy assets like gold, like art, like tangibles that will automatically go up if the dollar is overproduced. You want to make sure you do not overproduce the dollar, because if you do, investors will take their money away from employment-generating investments and try to make sure they are covered if the dollar loses a lot of value. So the Fed has to concentrate on maintaining the value of the dollar. The Fed did not do that at all in the 21st century, and we had the Great Recession.
Okay, now you're pointing that and I don't mean to belabor the point, but people said it was more a function of Wall Street running wild in the casino that we have. Was that a part of it? And if so, did government influence that casino? Did government open that casino or expand that casino through pressure on banks to loan?
Well, there's no question. Absolutely it did. I mean, Wall Street benefited from government handouts. I mean, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, essentially guaranteed the housing market of the United States. So Wall Street's looking at that, the big banks saying, oh, it's guaranteed I get my money back if there's loan defaults? Okay, I'll make the loans. And therefore we have the housing bubble. So, I mean, yeah, if you're going to have that kind of governmental intervention in the economy, there are going to be some really smart guys who take advantage of it, but the fault lies with the government.
Okay. History, you've mentioned throughout history the cycles of boom and bust and the idea that we have to have that. You're saying we really don't. Is that correct?
Absolutely. No, right. I mean, if you look at the pre-Federal Reserve income tax era, we always hear, the textbooks even tell us that there was a cycle of boom and bust in the 19th century. Boy, when you look at the busts in the 19th century, they're busts at like 1 or 2% growth. Today we call that a boom, and the booms were like 9 or 10% growth. I mean, so when we talk about there being a cycle of boom and bust before the Federal Reserve, it was all in the context of maximum economic growth.
Okay. Now, is this under the general idea that once the Federal Reserve got involved, what we would have is the government would not only be able to centrally plan the economy through an overreaching regulatory bodies, executive agencies, et cetera, but it could, and through the tax code, obviously, but it could do it with its foundation, which would be the money?
Yeah, I mean, it was a learning process. What happened is that they started overproducing the dollar right out of the gate as soon as the Fed was created, and that caused an inflation. And at the same time, they created an income tax, which was progressive in that the government got more money if there was inflation. And this interesting little relationship grew up. If the Federal Reserve causes an inflation, the federal government gets more income tax revenue. And it just was too beautiful a thing for the government not to indulge in, and that gave us the much more variable 20th century compared to the 19th, and now we have it in the 21st.
Can we pull back just a little to the economic myth coming out of, or one of the myths that came out of the Great Depression, which was FDR saved us from the end of our country economic downfall. He stopped it. And Hoover was painted as a guy who got us in by laissez-faire economics. Now, feel free to disabuse us of those myths in their entirety. But if you could focus in on the idea that somebody says, I mean, even an Alabama song, you know, about the WPA and the idea that these things actually helped us and saved us, when in fact, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but they exacerbated the situation, and they kept, and you point to the Treasury Secretary, I believe Morgenthau at the time, talking about the failed strategy. Go ahead.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt had no idea, none, why the Great Depression occurred. Nobody has ever demonstrated anything President Roosevelt ever said that indicated he understood why the Depression started. What he did for the first 4 years was he tried to change the subject, mainly through prosecutions of rich people like Andrew Mellon, Samuel Insull, these kinds of people. He was just trying to buy time. He had no idea why the Great Depression had started. Number two, The policy that FDR pursued was simply Herbert Hoover's policy stepped up a notch a little bit. Herbert Hoover raised the marginal income tax rate to 63% in 1932. All Roosevelt did was raise it to 73%. So, number one, FDR did not know why the Great Depression started. And number two, he pursued the maximization of Herbert Hoover's policy in responding to it. And that's why his Treasury Secretary said 6 years later, in 1939, you know what, the New Deal failed.
I know history doesn't repeat itself, but does it rhyme in the form of Bush, Obama versus Hoover, FDR?
I don't think there's any question that it rhymes. It absolutely does. The amazing thing is that there are other rhymes in history. There are long, extended periods of economic growth and mass prosperity. Why don't we get back to those? I mean, Ronald Reagan produced one that lasted for 25 years, and it was correlated with a stable dollar and tax cuts, and Bill Clinton basically maintained that. We just go back to that. We'll have a nice rhyming session that will remind us of the great days of our prosperity.
Well, then I have to play for you President Obama's take on those issues specifically, because I would like to get your response. Of course, you have addressed these. Nonetheless, it is important that we give the president his due. And here is the president. I believe it's cut number 9. Or actually, not cut number 9. Pardon me. Cut number 7. Cut number 7. Roll it.
You know, each of us is only here because somebody somewhere felt responsibility, yes, to their families, but also to their fellow citizens, also to our country's future. That's the American story. The American story is not just about what we do on our own. Yes, we're rugged individualists, and we expect personal responsibility, and everybody out there has got to work hard and carry their weight. But we also have always understood that we wouldn't win the race for new jobs and businesses and middle-class security if we were just applying some you're-on-your-own economics. It's been tried in our history, and it hasn't worked. It didn't work when we tried it in the decade before the Great Depression. It didn't work when we tried it in the last decade. We just tried this. What they're peddling has been tried. It did not work.
So obviously these things keep being said. Professor?
It is remarkable to hear somebody, let alone the President of the United States, say that the decade before the Great Depression was a terrible era of economic history. The decade before the Great Depression is the single most famous era of American prosperity that the nation has ever produced, the Roaring 1920s. So, I mean, that's a carnival of historical illiteracy.
And so a part of this is learning our economic history and our history overall and responses to it. And certainly we can look at I believe the early 20s when it comes to the response, doing the Bizarro Obama or the Bizarro FDR or even the Bizarro Hoover when it comes to the Great Depression. That said, when people are looking and saying, what about the meantime? Right now, we need infrastructure jobs. We need jobs. We're not lowering the unemployment. People are leaving the workforce. Where's your heart, Professor, when it comes to taking care of people in need when the economy is so bad?
The economy will turn towards an arc of growth, employment, entrepreneurial activity. It's a general boom in no time whatsoever if the United States stabilized the dollar, cut taxes, and limited regulation. This is what Ronald Reagan did in the early 1980s. As soon as that policy was implemented, to the day, you saw a 15-year boom start immediately. This is the way to succor the needy in the United States, to go back to the principles right away, the strong dollar, tax cuts, sparse regulation. The investment rush into the real economy will be so big and so fast, the poor will do very well, and they'll be in a new state of being part of the mass middle class.
What is the failure of being able to communicate what you just said to me? What do you see it as?
I'm not so certain that government is interested in the general prosperity of the American economy. I mean, let's remember that when the American economy booms, the one thing that shrinks is the government, especially in its relative size. So it has to be a pretty altruistic government that says, okay, I want to see myself shrink, maybe permanently, for the benefit of the real economy.
And so when we look at politicians, whether an R or a D, we have to address the size of government and not have what some have described, and I have at times, socialism and socialism light, Democrat to Republican. You've really got to change. You got to have a steering away. And is that what we're seeing being pronounced, in your opinion, in the likes of Rand Paul and others when it comes to limited government?
I'm pretty optimistic about Rand Paul, and the Republican Party has to get back to its roots. Heck, the Democratic Party could, if it wanted to, go back to John C. Calhoun and everything back in the 19th century. You have a small government, you're going to have a booming economy. I mean, there used to be a consensus among a lot of political figures in the United States across the party lines along this. But the thing is the greatest thing that ever happened to government in terms of its own size is it's figuring out how to make the economy falter. So the government has to get humble in order for the economy to boom.
That is Professor Brian Domitrovic. I've posted the link to his work right up on the Facebook. You can lock it in right now. At some point, we're going to do a complete 2 segments on his book alone, Econoclass. Check out his work. You just heard him. He's extraordinary. Sam Houston University. Professor, thank you. It is always a privilege and pleasure.
Great to be here, Chris.
Take care, buddy. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. Net neutrality. Vote is still being taken tomorrow. Voting on what, you say? Seton Motley tells us. AFR Talk.